Germany had surrendered, but Patton was staring at a problem victory had not solved. Inside a former prisoner camp near the collapsing Eastern Front, American officers found names that no longer matched the men standing in front of them. Some prisoners had been moved. Some records were missing. Some Americans had simply disappeared behind Soviet-controlled lines after liberation. Patton saw the pattern before many others wanted to admit it existed. The war in Europe was ending with parades, speeches and photographs, yet armed guards were still refusing access to camps, holding exhausted men whose nationality suddenly mattered less than politics. The enemy was changing shape, and Patton began to suspect the next conflict would not start with an invasion, but with silence. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing faster than even Allied planners had expected. Entire cities were surrendering without resistance. German commanders were negotiating localized ceasefires simply to avoid Soviet capture. Millions of displaced civilians, slave laborers, and prisoners of war were scattered across roads, rail stations, and ruined camps stretching from France to eastern Germany. Patton thrived in chaos when movement was possible. His Third Army had torn across France and deep into Germany with speed that made him famous and politically dangerous at the same time. He believed hesitation prolonged suffering. He believed pressure ended wars, and now the war appeared finished, at least officially. But the surrender created a different kind of battlefield. Germany's defeat had divided Europe into zones controlled by uneasy allies who no longer trusted one another. Soviet forces occupied vast territory in the east. American commanders operated under agreements meant to preserve Allied unity. Washington wanted stability. Eisenhower wanted cooperation. Publicly, the alliance against Hitler still existed. Privately, suspicion was growing. Reports coming into Allied headquarters described overcrowded camps, missing transport records, confused prisoner exchanges, and Soviet restrictions around certain liberated areas. The historical record does not give every detail of every encounter, but what is clear is that American officers increasingly encountered barriers where they expected cooperation. Patton noticed the change quickly. He had spent years measuring enemies by movement, deception, and control. Now he was watching supposed allies behave the same way, and nowhere was that tension more visible than inside the camps filled with men who had survived the war but still could not go home. The official story of victory suggested order would return once Germany surrendered. Camps would be liberated, prisoners would be identified, families would receive answers, armies would go home. Reality looked very different. Many German records had been destroyed during the final months of the war. SS personnel burned files while retreating. Rail systems collapsed. Guards abandoned camps. Prisoners marched across territories changing hands by the week. In some regions, Soviet and American forces reached liberated prisoners from opposite directions, each operating under separate command structures with different political priorities. That confusion created dangerous gaps. American officers began hearing stories that certain prisoners had vanished after liberation rather than before it. The surviving record does not always clarify whether these disappearances resulted from bureaucratic chaos, forced transfers, mistaken identities, or deliberate Soviet secrecy. But uncertainty itself became the problem. Patton hated uncertainty when American soldiers were involved. Accounts from the occupation period suggest growing frustration among some US officers regarding limited Soviet transparency around prisoner processing and camp access. The tension was real, even if every exchange was not recorded in detail. Patton's known command style makes the reaction understandable. He was aggressive, impatient, and deeply suspicious of delays that interfered with operational clarity. The contradiction disturbed him. The Allies had fought a war claiming liberation as a moral necessity, yet now liberated territory was producing new walls. Guards still controlled gates. Lists remained incomplete. Requests disappeared into military bureaucracy. Some camps could be inspected. Others suddenly became restricted zones. Victory was beginning to feel selective. And for men waiting to learn whether missing Americans were alive, dead, transferred, or forgotten, political caution sounded dangerously close to abandonment. Patton's concerns did not emerge from one dramatic moment. They grew slowly through fragments that refused to fit together cleanly. At first, the issue seemed administrative. Prisoner camps across Germany were overwhelmed. Thousands of men required medical treatment, identification, transportation, and food. Entire populations had been uprooted by the final offensives. Confusion was expected, but certain inconsistencies kept returning. American officers inspecting liberated areas sometimes discovered prisoner lists that no longer matched the people physically present. Some camps appeared partially emptied before Allied arrival. In other cases, displaced prisoners described transfers eastward during the final weeks of fighting, when German command structures were already collapsing. The exact numbers remain debated by historians. The records were incomplete then and remain incomplete now. But what mattered to Patton was not only the missing men. It was the pattern of resistance forming around the question itself. The answers came slowly, sometimes not at all. Then another problem appeared. Soviet authorities increasingly restricted movement in areas under their control. Certain camps required special permissions to inspect. Certain records became difficult to access. American liaison officers encountered delays that seemed political rather than logistical. The issue was no longer battlefield movement, but political access. Patton did not wait well. His worldview had been shaped by momentum. During combat, delay killed men. Hesitation allowed enemies to regroup. Now he watched paperwork and diplomacy create paralysis. While exhausted prisoners remained trapped inside systems nobody fully controlled. That was when Patton understood the problem was no longer German. The alliance itself was changing. The historical record suggests that many senior Allied figures still hoped cooperation with the Soviet Union could survive the war. Public unity remained strategically important. Nobody wanted open confrontation during the fragile occupation period. But on the ground, military officers were already seeing signs of division. The camps exposed those divisions with brutal clarity. A liberated prisoner camp should have symbolized the end of tyranny. Instead, some camps became spaces where authority blurred, accountability weakened, and information disappeared into competing command structures. Guards changed uniforms, but the gates remained guarded. Patton reportedly grew increasingly skeptical of Soviet intentions during this period. His broader anti-Soviet views are historically documented, though historians debate how far his suspicions extended regarding missing prisoners specifically. What is clear is that he viewed Soviet secrecy as deeply dangerous long before many American politicians openly admitted similar concerns. And the deeper investigators looked into camp logistics, the more complicated the picture became. Some prisoners feared repatriation because returning home meant possible punishment under Soviet authority. Eastern European refugees desperately tried to avoid forced return. Allied commanders struggled to manage displaced populations, while political agreements demanded cooperation between governments that increasingly distrusted each other. Human beings became administrative burdens. That reality disturbed Patton more than many people around him understood. He was not sentimental. He could be harsh, reckless, and politically explosive. But he also believed soldiers owed responsibility to their own men. Missing Americans represented unfinished business. Delayed answers felt unacceptable. Then came reports of camps where Soviet personnel refused immediate American inspection despite earlier expectations of Allied cooperation. The exact exchanges are not preserved in detail, but accounts suggest rising anger among American officers who encountered closed gates, delayed permissions, and incomplete responses. The tension was becoming evident. Victory had created zones where power mattered more than transparency. Patton began pushing harder for clarity, not publicly at first. The occupation system depended on maintaining Allied cohesion. Open accusations carried enormous political consequences, but privately, frustration spread through sections of the American command structure. The problem was larger than one camp. If prisoners could disappear inside post-war confusion, then victory itself contained a dangerous weakness. Armies could defeat Germany and still lose control of truth afterward, and the next refusal changed the meaning of victory. Because the issue was no longer whether the war had ended. The issue was who controlled what happened after the ending. The confrontation that changed Patton's thinking did not require gunfire. That was what made it unsettling. By mid-1945, Europe was technically at peace, yet armed checkpoints, restricted roads and guarded compounds still divided entire regions. Soviet forces controlled enormous territory. American commanders operated within carefully negotiated agreements designed to prevent Allied collapse. Patton increasingly viewed those agreements as restraints rather than safeguards. Accounts from the period suggest he became openly frustrated with what he saw as political softness towards Soviet behavior. His language could be inflammatory, his judgments were often blunt, but beneath the theatrics was a genuine fear that the United States was ignoring a developing threat, because admitting it would complicate the victory narrative. Inside one former POW processing area near the eastern occupation zones, that fear sharpened. American personnel reportedly encountered delays obtaining full prisoner information, while Soviet authorities maintained tight control over access procedures. The surviving record gives us the outcome, not every sentence spoken. But the result was unmistakable. The Americans did not receive the clarity they expected. Patton saw something larger in that refusal. The war had ended on paper, not for them. Men who survived Nazi imprisonment were still trapped inside political systems controlled by governments already preparing for influence, leverage, and post-war dominance. The camps had become symbols of transition. Germany was defeated, but mistrust was replacing cooperation faster than diplomats publicly admitted. Patton reacted badly to limits placed on American authority. That much is historically certain. He believed strength prevented confusion. He believed hesitation invited exploitation. And he increasingly suspected Soviet leadership interpreted Allied patience as weakness. The emotional contradiction haunted the occupation period. American soldiers celebrated victory while families still searched for missing names. Politicians spoke about peace while military officers argued over access rights and prisoner transfers. Europe was rebuilding physically while collapsing politically into competing spheres of control. Then came the realization Patton could not ignore. The problem could not be solved with tanks. An armoured division could crush resistance on a battlefield. It could not force honest cooperation from an ally determined to control information. The obstacle was no longer military capability. It was political silence. That made the situation more dangerous. Because silence was harder to fight, Patton's growing hostility towards Soviet intentions increasingly isolated him within higher command circles. Eisenhower prioritized stability and Allied coordination. Washington feared provoking unnecessary confrontation. The United States had just emerged from the deadliest war in its history. Few leaders wanted to discuss another looming conflict. Patton did, and the camps convinced him the conflict had already started in smaller, quieter ways. Not through invasions, through controlled access, delayed answers, missing records, strict movement, carefully managed truth. The gates stayed closed, and Patton began looking east, not as a victorious ally, but as a soldier watching the shape of the next enemy emerge. History would later call it the beginning of the Cold War. At the time it felt less dramatic and more confusing. There was no formal declaration. No single battle announced the transition. Instead, distrust spread through occupation zones, diplomatic meetings, refugee processing systems, and military coordination failures. The prisoner camps revealed those fractures early because they sat at the intersection of morality and power. Everyone claimed to support liberation. Not everyone agreed on what freedom meant afterward. Patton became increasingly controversial during the occupation period, partly because he spoke too openly about tensions many political leaders preferred to manage quietly. His criticisms of Soviet behavior alarmed superiors already struggling to preserve fragile post-war cooperation. He was admired by many soldiers, but viewed by others as unpredictable and politically dangerous. The camps intensified that reputation. The exact scope of missing prisoner issues remains historically debated. Some disappearances were undoubtedly caused by wartime chaos rather than deliberate conspiracy. Records vanished for many reasons. Millions of displaced people moved across Europe under catastrophic conditions. Responsible history requires acknowledging uncertainty where uncertainty exists. But uncertainty itself carried consequences. Families waited for answers that arrived slowly or never came. Former prisoners found themselves trapped inside new political systems immediately after surviving the old ones. Refugees feared forced repatriation. Allied officers discovered that defeating Germany had not eliminated secrecy or coercion from Europe. It had redistributed them. Patton recognized that faster than many others because he measured situations through control, movement, and intent. He saw patterns where politicians still saw temporary difficulties. Whether every fear he held was fully accurate matters less than the larger reality history eventually confirmed. The alliance was breaking apart. Within only a few years, Europe would be divided by ideological borders backed with armies, intelligence networks, propaganda systems, and nuclear fear. The cooperation that defeated Hitler would dissolve into suspicion so deep that former allies prepared for possible war against each other. And in Patton's mind, some of the earliest warning signs had appeared not in government conferences, but behind guarded camp fences where answers stopped moving freely. Victory had a shadow. and he saw it sooner than most. People often imagine wars ending with signatures and celebrations. Reality is usually colder than that. A war can end militarily while continuing psychologically, politically, and morally for years afterward. Europe in 1945 proved that. Millions survived the battlefield only to enter systems of occupation, suspicion, displacement, and silence that no surrender ceremony could instantly erase. Patton understood warfare through movement and pressure. He believed unresolved problems became future dangers. That instinct made him effective during combat and deeply controversial during peace. He struggled to accept political patience when human beings were still trapped inside uncertainty. The camps exposed a painful truth. Liberation is not the same thing as accountability. The gates opening does not guarantee honesty afterward. The uniforms changing does not guarantee trust. Sometimes victory creates new power structures before the old suffering is fully understood. Patton was flawed. He could be reckless, arrogant, and politically explosive. But his growing alarm about Soviet intentions reflected something larger than personal temperament. He sensed that the alliance holding the world together during war was already fracturing beneath the surface, and he saw ordinary prisoners caught inside that fracture first. That is what gives the story its lasting weight. The beginning of the Cold War was not only written in speeches or diplomatic cables. Part of it appeared in guarded camps, incomplete records, restricted access, and families waiting for names that never arrived. Because the last enemy of war is not always the soldier holding a rifle. Sometimes it is the powerful man deciding which questions no longer deserve answers.